I looked up and I saw this bright orange flash of the saber blowing up. And I shouted at the top of my dive, I shouted, "Sir, you got him."
Kissing on 2, clear takeoff, left hand. Takeoff left, left land, swim west, copy. Crossing 2-1. Crossing 2-4 is runway 28, ready for departure. Let's get 2-4 over here, takeoff for the...
Hello and welcome to the Blueskies podcast. I'm PR Ganapati, your host. Well, folks, today it's my pleasure to speak to Air Marshal Philip Rajkumar. Air Marshal Rajkumar was commissioned in 1962 into the fighter stream of the Indian Air Force. He served in many squadrons during his initial days, 47 Squadron, 1 Squadron during the 1965 war, 3 Squadron, and then he commanded 108 Squadron. He qualified as a test pilot from Ep03 in France, was a flying instructor in Iraq, and his last position in the Air Force as Air Marshal was the head of the National Flight Test Center, where he had a critical role to play in the development of the light combat aircraft, the Tejas, on which he's written 2 books, the most recent of which has just been published. Air Marshal Rajkumar has a Param Vishesh Seva Medal, an Ati Vishesh Seva Medal, a Vayu Sena Medal, and was mentioned in dispatches. Welcome to the program, Air Marshal Rajkumar.
Thank you, Guns.
Well, sir, if I can just get you started by giving us a background of where you grew up and what caused you to join the Air Force.
My father was a doctor in the old Mysore government medical service, and we were posted in Mysore in 1953 when at the age of 12, we moved to Bangalore. And one of the first sights that I saw in Bangalore at that time was the old vampire jet screaming over the city of Bangalore. So I looked at that and said, my God, this is where I want to be. As luck would have it, by the time I finished high school in 1956, an uncle of mine, a distant relation, he was posted at the Air Force Technical College in Jalahalli, and I badgered him to let me go and see the aeroplanes parked on the tarmac of the Air Force Technical College. And one of the aeroplanes there was a Vampire 52 fighter. So my uncle took me there and he turned on the battery, made me sit inside the cockpit, and he turned on the gun sight. And I said, wow, this is it. I've got to be a fighter pilot.
How old were you then, sir?
In 1956, I was 14 and a half, 15.
Fascinating. Must have been quite an impression.
Yeah, so very impressionable age. And so I stuck to what I had decided. And Dad, of course, being a doctor, was very keen on me following a medical line. So he said, you go and do your intermediate. So I went and finished my intermediate. Then he says, okay, how about doing medicine? I said, no, I want to join the Air Force. So then it led to a lot of bickering in the house. So finally he said, okay, you go and do your physics and maths BSc, which is what I did. And when I finished that, I was getting almost running out of age to join the Air Force. So finally, another uncle happened to be in Bangalore, and I spoke to him and made him persuade my father to let me join the Air Force. And on the 1st of July 1961, I went off to the Air Force Flying College. There, after finishing the basic on HT2s and intermediate stage on Harvard's, I was sent to the jet training wing at Hakimpet. And this was in July of 1962. I landed up in Hakimpet and started converting on to the Vampire. So that was a dream realized, great fun. And then as we were approaching the little beyond the midterm stage, the Chinese incursion took place on the 20th of October 1962, and we were all hurriedly pushed through and commissioned on the 10th of November 1962. And our applied stage of training was also shortened, and instead of reporting to the squadrons in June 63, we reported to squadrons by the end of February 1963. I was posted to number 47 squadron at Kalaikunda, which was flying the Tufani, the MD-450 Oregon.
Right.
The Tufani was a little more powerful than the Vampire. The Vampire had a 3,500 pound engine. The Tufani had a 5,000 pound engine. So it was a big deal. And anyway, after 4 or 5 months in the squadron, I was just about entering my ops day syllabus when the squadron was hurriedly moved overnight to Bagdogra on the Himalayan foothills. And at Bagdogra, I continued with my day ops training. But by then, the Chinese incursion had led to the United States offering to train 80 Indian Air Force pilots in gunnery. So we were split into 10 batches of 8, and we were sent off to the United States Air Force for training, which was
Fascinating.
a fantastic opportunity. But to do that, one had to get 200 jet hours and a white instrument rating. So by the end of 1963, I had those requirements. And in April 1964, I was winging my way to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas for a 1-month English language course, which turned out to be a bit of a holiday.
Right.
Then we flew the T-33 at Randolph Air Force Base, and then did about 10 or 12 hours, didn't go solo. Then we were transferred to Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas for the actual
Right.
gunnery. And
Right.
that was a fantastic phase of training because they were very professional and we learned a lot. And the funny thing was, in the same squadron in which we were training, we had pilots from many other countries, including Pakistan.
How fascinating. Wow.
And the Pakistani pilots and the Indian pilots, we all were in the same bachelor officers' quarters, and we were great friends.
Well, friends with the Pakistanis. That's quite an interesting setup. Just join us on the other side as we continue this story.
Just need 70, Roger, report IP Southeast, connection for Midway, and you selected.
And so what happened after you returned, sir?
Anyway, in September 1964, we finished 5 months in the United States. I came back to Delhi and was posted to number 1 squadron on Misters at Adhampur. So the squadron commander was the wing commander Om Prakash Taneja, and his 2 flight commanders were squadron leader Paddy Earl and squadron leader Denny Satur. And squadron leader Sudarshan Handa was one of the senior squadron leaders in the squadron.
Can you tell us a little more about the Mystere? What sort of aircraft was it? What was it capable of performance-wise? What sort of role did we procure it for? And what was it like to fly?
The Mystere was, again, from the Marcel Dassault stable, and it was a vast improvement on the Tufani because it had a more powerful engine, the Hispano-Suiza Verdon, which was 7,500 pounds. And the Mystere it could carry a lot of armament. It could carry 36 68 millimeter rockets under the wings. And then it had a belly station which you could carry 55 of the 68 millimeter rockets. Then it had 2 EFA cannons. And performance-wise, it was supersonic in a dive, but it couldn't match the Hunter because the Hunter was more powerful. It was a 10,000 pound airborne engine, whereas the Mystere was stuck at 7,500 pounds. And so the performance was not as good as that of the Hunter, but it was very good for ground attack because it was able to carry a big load. Now, because of the underpowered engine, it took a long takeoff roll to get it off the ground. But once you got up to speed of about 400 knots, she was a delight to fly. And unlike the Hunter, which had a manual reversion for the flying controls, the Mister had only hydraulic controls. It had 3 systems, and there was no manual reversion. So it was more sophisticated as far as flying controls went, and the handling qualities were very good. Another drawback was the Hunter had a ground level ejection seat, but the Mister unfortunately had an ejection seat which had a minimum ejection height of 2,000 feet.
Right.
So that was a drawback. But we loved the Mister because it was a delight to fly and could really pack a punch, and was used mainly in the air-to-ground role. The air-to-air role, when we used to have dissimilar aircraft air combat training with the Hunters or Nats, we always came out second best because those aeroplanes had more power reserve. They could outturn us, and so the lesson we learned during that period was that we shouldn't get into a dogfight with any aircraft, especially the Sabre, because we knew how the Sabre handled having flown it the previous year in the US. So things were on a roll till the last week of April in 1965, when the Pakistanis intruded in the Kutch sector, and the Air Force was put on alert. And our training was stopped, and a number of QFIs, about 7 or 8 flying instructors from training command, were attached to a squadron. And we spent the whole of May and June of 1965 baking in the crew room. There were no ACs or anything, not much flying. But at the end of June, the alert was called off, and I pushed off on leave to Bangalore. And I was recalled at the end of August. I was recalled. And the Pakistanis had started Operation Gibraltar at Jammu and Kashmir, where they sent in a lot of infiltrators, and they were being sorted out by the army. When that Operation Gibraltar failed, the Pakistan Army High Command launched what is called Operation Grand Slam on the 1st of September. And their grand plan was to cut off the Jammu Srinagar highway at a place called Aknur, and then there were no alternate road communication available at that time, and effectively isolated J&K and left it at the mercy of only air supply.
Were you fully operational on the Mystia by this time? Had you completed your syllabus?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question, because I told you in May and June of 1965 there was not much flying, but we had to do some night flying. So we were hurriedly given a dual check and a vampire trainer, and I did one sortie, my first solo in a Mystia at night. And then I told you I went off on leave. When I came back in August, and I was sent to Sulur with another officer to ferry the last 2 Mystias out of Sulur from storage. And then when I got back to the squadron on the 1st of September, the war had broken out in the Chump sector, and the squadrons in Pathankot were heavily engaged, the Nats and the Mystias. So we were eagerly looking forward to some action, and when it was decided that we should complete a night syllabus. So one more sortie in the vampire trainer, and then I did my second solo on the Mystia. And I was declared fully ops, ready to go to war.
Fascinating.
And so like that, for 4 or 5 days, we were chewing our nails in the crew room, listening to the stories coming out of Pathankot, where Nats mixing it up with the Sabres. And finally, on the 6th of September, the Indian Army opened the Lahore front because to relieve pressure in the Chum sector. The Indian Army was badly placed in Chum because they were caught off guard. And to relieve pressure in that sector, Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri took the bold move of opening a second sector in Lahore. Our Indian armies advanced across the international border on the Amritsar-Lahore axis.
Right.
So we were expectantly waiting to go into operations on the 6th, but the CO, Wing Commander Taneja, led a 4 aircraft search and strike mission, but they didn't see anything much, and we came back. Actually, when the Indian Army opened the front on the morning of 6th, we should have been over Pakistani airfields attacking their aircraft on the ground.
Right.
But we didn't do it. And for years and years, we were very upset about this. Finally, on the 50th anniversary of that war, Air Marshal Bharat Rakshak came out with a book called Duels of the Himalayan Eagle, in which, after doing extensive research, he said Prime Minister Shastri had expressly forbidden Air Marshal Arjun Singh, the chief of the Air Force, from attacking Pakistani airfield on the morning of 6th. Now, there's a reason for this. It was less than 3 years since the Chinese incursion, and that was an ignominious defeat for the Indian Army. And everybody was very, very concerned about Chinese interference in case a large-scale conflict erupted with Pakistan. So Prime Minister Shastri decided that we should not escalate the conflict beyond reasonable limits, and he forbade the Air Force from attacking the airfields.
Right.
Pakistanis didn't have any such restriction, and they attacked our airfields at Pathankot, Adhampur, and Halwara on the evening of 6th. And in Pathankot, especially, the carnage was extensive. We lost 10 aircraft on the ground. And Adhampur, we lost the MiG. In Halwara, we lost 2 hunters. And next morning on 7th September, we were asked to retaliate by attacking Sargodha.
Just need 70, Roger, report time southeast, connection, for midway, and field selected.
So where were you on the 6th when they struck Adhampur? What was that experience like?
When the saber strike over Adhampur did not materialize, we saw them on the western horizon, but for some reason they did not come over the airfield, though we sounded the air raid siren and we all got into trenches. But the attack never came. Later on, we discovered that the sabers had flown head-on into an IAF Dakota carrying supplies to Adhampur, and the Pakistani leader was none other than Alam, the famous squad leader Alam.
Yeah.
He very wisely said, now the defenses have been alerted, I have lost surprise, so he went back.
Right.
But later on in the evening, when we were packing up and going home at about 6:30, it was just getting dark. A B-57 appeared over the airfield and bombed the operational readiness platform where we lost the MiG. And he dropped another bomb which fell on the side of the runway. Fortunately, it didn't crater the runway. So the next morning, we were told to attack Sargodha at dawn at 6 a.m.
Right.
So I was number 12 in a 12 aircraft strike.
Can I just stop you here, and if you could
Yeah.
just give us a sense of the importance of Sargodha to the Pakistani Air Force, and why was that chosen as the target?
Sargodha was one of the biggest air bases in Pakistan. It had 2 or 3 Sabre squadrons based there. At that time in 1965, the 2 big bases were Mauripur and Karachi, where the B-57 bombers were based, and the Sabres were 3 squadrons were there at Sargodha and were supposed to be very heavily defended. And it also had a radar unit on the hills close by. So it was a very important base for them. And having lost so many aeroplanes the previous evening, probably the IAF leadership felt that we should give a fitting response. So 1 squadron, 12 aircraft went to Sargodha, but now this takeoff was in the dark at 5:30 a.m. and the funny thing was, this was my third takeoff at night. I told you I'd flown only two sorties.
Right.
Now, this time I was getting airborne in the dark with 2,000 pounders, full fuel, and full gun ammunition. Very heavyweight configuration.
My goodness.
And then we had 12 aircraft and two standbys. Two standbys are supposed to start up and wait on the operational readiness platform. And if anybody dropped out, they were supposed to come in. Nobody had dropped out, but just as I was about to roll, one of the standby aircraft squad leader, Devaya, I didn't know who it was at that time, but later on came to know. He just entered the runway in front of me and in front of my deputy leader and myself and started rolling. Now, I told you the previous evening the Pak aircraft had dropped a bomb and had thrown a lot of earth and pieces of shrapnel onto the runway. There was no time to sweep the runway or anything. So we just rolled. And as I was raised my nose wheel, I had to go through this cloud of dust and lost visual reference for about 2 or 3 seconds. When I came out, I saw this enormous mist filling my windshield.
Oh
They
my
were
goodness.
got airborne just ahead of me, and I was about to collide with them. So the mist had a characteristic. If you unstuck slightly prematurely, she yawed to the right, which is what I did. I yawed and staggered into the air and cleaned up the aircraft and tried to catch up with the other members of the formation. So I had lost them by that time because they were all flying without navigation lights. So I burnt up fuel and came back and landed.
Right.
But on the landing roll, probably my tire was cut because by the shrapnel on the runway. Because even though I made a smooth touchdown, I had 2,000 pounders, but I had a right tire burst, and the aircraft sort of started veering off the runway.
Wow.
But I managed to control it and turn off onto the taxi track. And as I went back to the crew room, the rest of the formation returned from Sargodha, and I found that my formation, I was number 4 in the last formation, had failed to hit target because of a navigation error. The leader was squad leader Sudarshan Handa, and his wingman was a chap called Darshan Brar,
Oh my.
and the deputy leader was Group Captain Kahai. So during the debrief, Taneja, the CEO, got quite upset. He said, "Why didn't you guys go to the target? So load up and go back." Now, the whole idea of going at 5:30 a.m. was to have the cover of darkness at least for
Right.
the ingress and the element of surprise and all that. Now, in broad daylight, we were asked to attack Sargodha at 10:15.
Well, friends, that's the setup. A broad daylight raid on Sargodha, the most heavily defended, most important airbase in Pakistan, and in broad daylight at 10:15 in the morning. Join us in a few seconds as we continue the conversation with Air Marshal Rajkumar.
Just need 70, Roger, report IP southeast, connection for midway, and yield selected.
Welcome back. So that must have been pretty nerve-wracking. Was it the same 4 of you who were detailed?
But the same formation, Handa number 1, Brar number 2, Kahai 3, and self 4. So we took off at 9:45, and 30 minutes later we pulled up over Sargodha. And we were extremely fortunate that 3 Sabres and 1 F-104, which are doing the combat air patrol over Sargodha, had just landed for refueling. In fact, they were being refueled on the Warpi when we dropped our bombs and strafed them.
Oh my goodness, wow.
So the Pakistanis admitted only the loss of 1 Sabre, but I think till today they have admitted the loss of only 1 Sabre, but I think they would have definitely lost those 4 aircraft. Anyway, the good thing was that all 4 of us made it back. We flew at extremely low level, and a lot of anxious moments because fuel was very, very low. And we made it back to Adhampur, and I switched off with 200 pounds out of some 5 or 6,400 pounds that I was carrying. I finally switched off with 200 pounds, which would have given me about 3 to 4 minutes of flying time.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing.
Anyway, it was good to come back, and that evening we had a scare that paratroopers were going to attack Azampur, so we were called back to the squadron, and we spent the night sitting in the trenches, firing at imaginary intruders and all that.
Right.
Now remember, this was my very first operational sortie. I was 24 years old.
Right.
And not quite experienced. I had probably 560 or 570 hours in my logbook. And after that, for the remainder of the war, from the 7th of September till 22nd September, we did mainly combat air patrols over our own territory, over the airfield, and we did cross-border strikes, close support missions for the army, mainly in the Lahore and Sialkot sectors.
Right.
So we destroyed a few tanks and soft-skin vehicles, attacked only military targets, and the B-57s used to raid our airfield at night. And on the 13th of September, our airfield, Azampur airfield, was badly hit by a B-57. So the next evening, we were ordered to move to Ambala, finish the last strike over the Lahore sector, and head for Ambala. A whole heap of missiles would be there. Some 28 to 30 missiles would be parked out in the open. Till on the 17th of September, the B-57 appeared over Ambala.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
And he dropped his bomb. Mercifully, the bomb fell short and destroyed the church in Ambala.
Right.
But if it had skipped and landed in those 30 missiles, we probably lost all of them. But we were fortunate to get away with that.
Hang on, folks. There's more to come. Just stay tuned.
Visual to Just need 70, Roger, report time southeast, Greenwich, B54, come advise, and yield selected.
So one of the things we try to do is put our audience in the cockpit with you. So just give me a sense for what it was like as you reached the initial point and then pulled up. What did you see? The entire Sargodha complex. What were you thinking of? What were the radio calls people were making? What were you seeing?
Yeah. Now, when we were ordered to go back, I was scared stiff. I've never been so frightened in my life. but you can't say, Mama, I'm not going. So you go. And fortunately, once you sit in the cockpit and start up, all fear vanishes because you're so busy concentrating on the mission. Now, we went at very low level, maybe 150, 200 feet. And my main job was the two wingmen. Our job was to look behind and keep the tail clear.
Right.
So we continued that way and kept scanning the sky for enemy aircraft. And then we hit this railway line, which is northeast of Sargodha, and turned left. Now, Sargodha is a 3113 runway. And when we pulled up and rolled into the dive, that's the first time I saw the Sargodha complex. Meanwhile, I was the last man on the dive. I was about 1,500 yards behind the leader. The leader had already dropped his bombs on a bulk petroleum installation short of the runway. And he spotted these runways and he strafed. And his first burst hit this saber, the middle saber. And he started shouting, aircraft on the runway, aircraft on the runway. And I looked up and I saw this bright orange flash of the saber blowing up. And I shouted at the top of my dive, I shouted, sir, you got him.
Wow.
And then now I was far too high to point my nose at the thing, but Kahai, definitely my deputy leader, dropped his bombs on those aircraft. Whether they hit, exploded or skipped, we don't know. But anyway, I dropped my bombs and destroyed the air traffic control building. And at that time, Brar, the number 2, called out bogey. Bogey means unidentified enemy aircraft.
Right.
And left 8 o'clock high. So I looked to my left and I saw flak bus. There was a lot of flak. And so I said, that's only flak. But the leader said buster. Now, buster means open full throttle.
Right.
And our nav planning was only for 2 minutes for getaway at full throttle, but we carried on for 8 minutes at full throttle.
Oh my goodness.
So I became very low on fuel. My bingo light, the 1600 pounds light, came on when I was well to the west of Lahore. And then I became very low on fuel. I got the other, after bingo at 1800, you have the next call at 600. You say thirsty, no? That means you're really down.
Right.
So my thirsty call came, and Anda said, you are over Indian territory now, you can eject if you have to. So I had no intention of doing that. But we overflew a gun defended area, which was the Amritsar radar unit. And our own guns opened up. And I could see these red tracers coming straight at you and burning out.
Oh my goodness. Oh.
The tracers you can see, but what you don't see are the ones which are supposed to hit you. So you sort of try and crouch into a little ball in the cockpit and hope like hell you don't get hit. So then as soon as we crossed Amritsar, I eased up. I told Honda I'm easing up to 6,000 feet. I eased up. And from a distance, it was fortunately a very clear day. And from a distance of about 10 miles or so, I caught sight of the Adhampur runway, throttled back and went landed. So it was a very, very high voltage, high adrenaline rush sortie. And after the debrief, I came back to the crew room and I grabbed a cup of tea and sat down. And I found my knees were shaking.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
The adrenaline rush was over.
Over. Mm.
So that was that. But after this very high voltage drama on the very opening sortie of my life, the remaining sorties in the Lahore and Sialkot sector were, child's play, so to speak. You hardly went in for 2-3 minutes, looked for army positions and emptied your load and came back. So, and in the evening we were back in the mess. So
right.
The real fighting was the poor Jawans were in their trenches in contact with the enemy.
Yeah.
So that was the 65 war, a great experience. Now Wing Commander Taneja, during the run-up the previous year, he hardly ever flew with us. He was, he used to come late to the squadron and come at 11, pack up by 1. He hardly flew. So we said, what kind of a CO do we have? But when the balloon went up, my God, the transformation was dramatic. Homi Taneja flew a few sorties and led the very first strike across the border. He led the Sargodha raid and continued leading from the front right through the war. I said, this is what military leadership is all about. It's setting the example when the bullets are flying around. And thereafter I hero worshipped Om Prakash Taneja. And in fact, in 2016, he was 89 years old and suffering from cancer. I went up to Delhi just to have dinner with him once. And I met him for the last time. He passed away in July of 2017. But he was somebody I held in such enormous esteem because of the leadership that he demonstrated during the war.
Fascinating, fascinating.
And thereafter, what happened was the Pakistani B-57 raids had no opposition at all in 65 because we had no night interception capability. Zero.
Correct.
So then in the middle of 66, we started getting the Type 77 MiG-21 with an airborne interception radar, the R2L, and the K-13 missiles. And so we started doing a lot of night flying. And over a period of 3-4 years, we had developed a very good night air defense capability, which was very useful in during the December 71 conflict, because the B-57 raids sort of petered out. There were not many raids. They wouldn't come over the airfields at night because they knew that the MiGs were around.
Right.
So depending on what weapons the other side has, you've got to develop counters well in time. In peacetime, you're going to use it in war. That's the lesson.
Right.
Then in early 71, the Air Force decided that we needed to have a specialist unit for tactics and combat, development of tactics and combat techniques in the IA. And they started this tactics and combat development and training squadron at Adhampur. And in June, we moved to Ambala. And I was sent off to headquarters to learn French because my name had come for the French test pilots course.
Right.
So I came back to the unit sometime in September, and I was told that we don't know whether your signal will come, whether you're going or not. So you better get into the act and start practicing low-level nav at night, because the task given to the squadron was to carry out single aircraft night bombing raids, harassment raids over Pak airfields. We were supposed to take off from Amritsar, go to Chaklala, Shorkot Road, and so on. The airfields, which were about between 22 and 25 minutes flying time from Amritsar.
And which aircraft were you operating at that time?
MiG-21s. MiG-21s with a ventral tank and 2,000-pound bombs and was nothing. And the only nav aid, there was no GPS and all that. The only nav aid we had was compass and stopwatch.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
And the entire Punjab countryside on both sides was completely blacked out. So you just had to steer a course and time and go and hope like hell that you arrived over the target. And usually what used to happen later on, my friends told me, was that the Pak gunners would open up and give away their position when they heard the aircraft coming.
Fascinating.
So while I was training for this, on the 8th of October, the signal came and I pushed off to France for test pilot training. So I missed the 71 war.
Oh boy. Okay.
And then over the next 20 years, I returned in 72 and 72, between 1972 and 1993, 1972 and 2001, over a period of 29 years, I spent something like 20 years in the flight testing specialization. In between, of course, you had to go and command a squadron, command a station, do staff jobs at headquarters and all that. To tick the boxes kind of assignments. So I did all that, and finally in 1994, September 94, Dr. Abdul Kalam asked for my services to head the flight test program of the light combat aircraft. So I came to Bangalore and set up the National Flight Test Center. I was quite convinced in my mind that we needed could be a small group, but we needed a group which was devoted exclusively to the LCA program, because we had to interact with the designers, we had to develop the control law for the fly-by-wire, there was a lot of simulator flying to be done. And so I had only a very small group, maybe 6 or 7 people, but we were eyes down focused only on that. And finally, in spite of the US sanctions between 1998, after Pokhran II, the US withdrew all support. All Western countries withdrew support, and even in spite of that, we managed to fly it. And if I'm allowed to beat my own drum a little bit, I've said all this in the Radiance in Indian Skies, the book that has just been released by Desidoc. So I could perhaps put a link on it, and interested people can read that book, which gives the full LCS story.
Yeah, no, I think we'll definitely put a link to both your books, which really offer a fascinating insight into all the challenges that we overcame in building this aircraft. A tremendous success that it has now become and is in operational service. I know I'd promised to take not more than an hour of your time, and we're at time. And I want to thank you for your generous and insightful conversation, putting us in the cockpit with you, attacking Sargodha. I'd love to have a further conversation with you sometime about training at Ep03, test flying, and the Tejas project, but I'll set up time for that separately. Really want to thank you for your time and just a wonderful recounting of the experiences that you had.
Yeah. Thank you, Guns. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to speak to you.
Well, folks, that's all we have time for this week. Join us again next week. In the meantime, sign up for updates at blueskiespodcast.com. There you'll find links to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also write to us with your comments, questions, suggestions, and feedback from the website or to blueskies@prganapati.com. Subscribe to the podcast on any podcasting platform such as Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and even on YouTube. If you like what you heard, share it with your friends, give us a rating in your favorite podcasting app, and write us a review. It will help other people find us. I want to give my thanks to Saurav Chordia for our logo and Prithvik for the music. I want to reiterate that all the views expressed here are personal, and this podcast has not been approved by or reviewed by the Air Force, Ministry of Defense, or any branch of the government. In the meantime, stay safe and Jai Hind.